Hello, I am Andy Versosa, Executive Director and Curator of Stanley-Whitman House in Farmington, Connecticut. Today, we present the fifth program in a series of 7, When Two Worlds Met, Indigenous Women in the Northeastern American Contact Period, curated by Gail White Usher. This program investigates what we know about women's matriarchal culture before contact with Europeans and then examines decades of dramatic change and social upheaval. We will look at work and responsibilities, everyday items like tools and clothing, skills such as pottery, and more. We at Stanley-Whitman House acknowledge that we are situated in the homeland of the Tungus people, who later invited the Mohegan, Wangunk, Quinnipiac, and other displaced Native people to join them here. Today, 5 nations, the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shaktakoke, and Golden Hill Pagusset, and the descendants of other Native peoples continue to serve as stewards of this land. With this acknowledgement, we recognize the legacies of settler colonialism, and we signal an ongoing commitment to building relationships with the indigenous communities who have lived on these ancestral lands for almost 15,000 years and to the future nations. Stanley-Whitman House is committed to recognizing, celebrating, and learning from the profound cultures, histories, and perspectives of Indigenous peoples. We're delighted to have Gail White Usher present the 5th of 7 monthly programs. Gail is a distinguished educator and researcher specializing in New England's early history, with her insights centering on the intricate relationships between Native American and European immigrant women in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Her fascination with the dynamic interactions between these two worlds will certainly foster enriching conversations. Gail's extensive knowledge and unique perspective are grounded in her roles as the Education Coordinator for Historic New England, Chair of the Woodstock Historic District Commission, and President of Chamberlain Mill. Tonight, we'll explore the pivotal interactions between European explorers and the indigenous peoples of North America, utilizing original materials like documents, maps, drawings, and surviving objects to delve into the impactful events that shaped a continent. The repercussions of these initial interactions resonate to this day, and our series aims to explore these events in depth, fostering a deeper understanding of this controversial and complex era. This series of discussions is rooted in the tradition of the Conversation Club, formed in 1818 in Farmington, Connecticut. Much like its inspiration, our club aims to discuss the leading issues of the day, making new ideas and perspectives accessible and prompting meaningful dialogue and reflection, helping us envision the future. Thank you for joining us. Let's warmly welcome Gail White Usher as she leads us in telling untold stories and unearthing the lost voices from When Two Worlds Met. Enjoy the conversation. Gail?
Thank you very much, Andy, and hello to everyone. My topic today is Indigenous Women of the Northeast, a Changing World. We know much less about the lives of Northeast America's Indigenous women than we do about the men. And what we do know reflects 16th, 17th, and 18th century European and early American male perspectives. Now, we do find information in captivity narratives as well, but these are often the recollections of terrorized and traumatized children. In the 16th and 17th centuries, women's interactions with European men were not common. Indigenous women were shielded, as were children, by the men in their communities. During this time, European women occupied subordinate roles in their societies, and this same attitude transferred from Europeans into their commentary on Indigenous women. In their view, women were on the periphery, little relevant except as curiosities. In the early period of contact between the two cultures, drawings and sketches have survived. These are combined with descriptions, random observations, and the recollections of later generations, and help us to flesh out our likely very incomplete understanding of the lives of the Northeast Indigenous women. Now, as interactions between the two cultures increased throughout the 18th century, More observations were recorded as text and art. When the surviving record is combined with archaeology, we're able to build a better but still incomplete understanding of their lives. And we will begin with the European perspective. Edward Winslow of Plymouth Colony writes in 1623, "The women live a most slavish life. They carry all their burdens, set and dress their corn, gather it in, seek out much of their food, beat and make ready the corn to eat, and have all household care lying upon them." A year later, Captain Christopher Levitt, who is off the southwest coast of Maine, observes, "Their wives are their slaves and do all their work. The men will do nothing but kill beasts, fish, etc." William Wood, writing in New England Prospect in 1634, writes, "To satisfy the curious eye of women readers, who otherwise might think their sex forgotten or not worthy a record, let them peruse these few lines, wherein they may see their own happiness, if weighed again in the women's balance of these ruder Indians. In wintertime, they are their husbands' caterers, trudging to the clam banks for their belly timber, and their porters to lug home their venison. They likewise stow their husbands' shoes and weave coats of turkey feathers, besides all of their ordinary household drudgery, which daily lies upon them. Commendable is their mild carriage and obedience to their husbands, notwithstanding all this their customary churlishness and savage inhumanity, but rest themselves content under their helpless condition, counting it the woman's portion. Since the English arrival, comparison hath made them miserable, foreseeing the kind usage of the English to their wives." When we jump forward a century to 1772, this is Benjamin West's Treaty of Penn with the Indians. And if you look at this very classically done painting, you'll note in the lower right corner a rendering of an Indigenous woman and her children. Now, this coupling of a woman and a nursing woman is very common, and one finds it repeated over and over from some of the earliest sketches and drawings all the way up through the early 19th century paintings that occur. And here's a close-up of that. Women are usually depicted in this very tightly defined domestic nurturing role. Indigenous women had many responsibilities, it's true. And to them fell a lot of the work in the village, in the home. They were responsible for the family, and that included caring for elders, raising children, and ensuring the health of the family. They were responsible for cooking, food preservation, for gathering wood and water. They made baskets, mats, pots for cooking, and clothing. They were also responsible for the preparation of various animal hides. The food that they provided for their family and the village by farming, assisting with fishing, and gathering and forage was equally as important to the success of the community as the men's hunting. And so we're going to look at some of these aspects of women's work. They were farmers and foragers. As William Wood says, another work is their planting of corn, wherein they exceed our English husbandmen, keeping it so clear with their clamshell hoes as if it were a garden rather than a cornfield, not suffering a choking weed to advance his audacious head above their infant corn, or an undermining worm to spoil his spurns, meaning the roots of the plant. Women grew corn, beans, squash, and other crops dependent upon their location and the quality of the soil. They grew strawberries, for example, and melons. They gathered plants for food and for medicines. So berries, fruits, nuts, and medicinal plants like sassafras and willow. And we'll explore the foodways of the indigenous people in our final conversation. Women were responsible for food preparation and preservation, as well as for creating the pots in which they cooked the food. They cooked in clay pots, which they made from clay that they gathered from along the riverbank. Thomas Morton describes this in 1637. They have earthen pots of diverse sizes, from a quart to a gallon, 2 or 3, to boil their vitals in. Very strong, though they be thin like our iron pots. And the clay pots that they produced are generally egg-shaped. They vary from tribe to tribe in terms of design, the collar design, and the collar is what enabled them to suspend the pot over a fire. A rope would go just under the collar and hang onto a pole above the fire. Some had dramatic points, as you see in these two. Others were quite simple. And pots themselves did not all have to be this more elaborate shape. They could be smaller, depended on the need and the use. Daniel Gookin in 1674 describes them as follows. Their household stuff is but little and mean. The pots they seed their food in, which were heretofore and yet are in use among some of them, made of clay or earth, almost in the form of an egg, the top taken off. Women produced the baskets and baskets were what held all of their household possessions, carried and stored food, and even were produced tightly enough that they could carry water. As John Jocelyn in 1674 observes, delicate sweet dishes, too, they made of birch bark, sewed with threads drawn from spruce or white cedar roots. These they make of all sizes, from a dram cup to a dish containing a pottle, meaning a half gallon. Likewise, buckets to carry water. And the water carrying buckets were, first of all, built very tight, and then the joints are sealed, or they are woven, which brings us to one of the most important tasks of skills of women, which is weaving. And they wove baskets, as John Jocelyn again says, baskets, bags, and mats, woven with the bark of what he calls the lime tree, and rushes of several kinds, dyed as before, some black, blue, red, yellow. Bags with porcupine quills woven and dyed also. The women are the workers of most of these. The illustration is taken in the early 20th century, and it shows a woman weaving a mat on an A-frame. And it appears that she's using rushes to weave. Now, the mats were used on the floors of wigwams and longhouses. They also covered the walls, a bit like we might consider wall tapestry, covering a wall in a medieval castle. And so they helped to decorate the home, to make the home more comfortable, got rid of the need to be living on a dirt floor. And also, when they're used in the longhouses that were occupied in the winter months, helped to insulate the home. Thicker mats could be woven, and these sometimes were used as the outer covering of the summer lodges. And the women prepared animal skins. William Wood observes in 1634 of their several arts and employments as first in dressing of all manner of skins, which they do by scraping and rubbing. Sometimes they take off the hair. And so this is, oops, I do apologize. This is a modern example, a modern depiction of two Indigenous women scraping a deer skin clean. And they're using, for their demonstration, and I have highlighted in the other photograph, a bone scraper. And prior to the arrival of metal knives and other implements that replace them, the tools with which the women worked the hides were bone and stone. Now, the process of preparing the hide is fairly complex and takes a significant amount of time. Once the deer is hunted, the men will bring the animals back to the village, and then from then on, the animals go into the hands of the women. The women dress the hide. They extract the meat, the bones, the organs. They distribute the meat throughout the village, beyond just their own families, but to others who might need it, who are unable to hunt for themselves. The hides are completely cleaned out. Then they are stretched onto a frame, and you see all of the ties, which are used to really stretch that skin out to its fullest extent. And then using the bone scrapers, they completely scrape out any remaining tissues from the inside of the hide. Once that's done, the hide needs to be softened, and it's what we now call brain tanning. And that process uses the brain of the animal, which is mashed into a paste and thoroughly spread onto the skin on the inside of the skin and allowed to saturate it. And it remains there for a period of time. Once it has done its job, which means the enzymes that are in the brain break down the collagen in the skin and are softening it, then the hide is washed, and the hide is no longer on the frame at this point. It's washed clean and then restretched onto the frame so that it dries flat. Once dried, it's still going to retain a certain stiffness, and so then the women need to hand work it, and sometimes even on the stiffer parts, using their teeth to bite into it to fully soften it completely, creating a material then that is soft enough to feel comfortable to wear, whether you're wearing it as a skirt or leggings or moccasins. It becomes that comfortable material that you can wear. Once the hide has been prepared and is ready for use, then the women do what I've got in quotes, we might call sewing. They did not have the ability, when using just bone or antler tools, to be able to really sew the hides together. Instead, what they did was, first having cut what they needed using stone knives, they then used bone awls, like the one in the example, to pierce holes in the hide wherever they needed to combine two hides. And then they used sinew or spruce root to lace the hides together. Sinew was the usual material that was used, and lace the hides together, lace the pieces of deerskin together to form the moccasins, lace the legging up the side of a man's leg. So that served for sewing. That was the way in which they were able to combine, put hides together for their clothing. The women, of course, were responsible for caring for the children. The image I have on the right-hand side is another early 20th century image, and it shows a woman who is weaving, and on her back she has a cradle board with her baby. Cradle boards were common all across the United States. And in the East, we know that they were in use when the first explorers are arriving. That's something that they've observed, and it have been in use, in fact, are still in use. They're really pretty simple. They're a little bit like a backpack for babies. You've got the flat board that is what the infant lies on. There's a platform at the base for the child's feet for a support. The brace around the top, the frame around the upper part, is designed to protect the baby's head. It's going to deflect any branches that might whip against the child's face if a woman was walking through the woods, for example. And it was also used to dangle, as far as we understand, feathers or bits of or leaves or something that might act as an amusement for the child. Now they can be very elaborately decorated or very simple, like the one we see here in this example. The baby is swaddled and bundled and tied into the cradle board. And it's a very secure, safe way to have a young child with you, and also make sure that your hands are free. When a woman was in whenever location she was going to be working in, if she was comfortable with it, she could take the cradle board off and lean it against a rock or a tree, and the child is still in a very safe position. To carry the cradle board, there's a burden strap that runs from each side of the top of the cradle board across and around the woman's head. So people tended to carry weights from a strap that went around their head, their neck being one of the strongest muscles in their body. And I'm going to close this little section by an observation by Mary Jemison de Goananas, who lived from 1743 until 1833. As a young child, she was taken captive by the Seneca and lived for decades with the Seneca people. In 1824, she wrote a recollection of her life as a young child. She writes, "Our labor was not severe, and that of 1 year was exactly similar in almost every respect to that of the others, without the endless variety that is to be observed in the common labor of the white people. Notwithstanding, the Indian women have all the fuel and bread to procure and the cooking to perform. Their task is probably not harder than that of white women, who have those articles provided for them. And their great cares certainly are not half as numerous, not as great. In the summer season, we planted, tended, and harvested our corn, and generally had all our children with us, but had no master to oversee or drive us, so that we could work as leisurely as we please." Now, there have been quite a number of renditions of Indigenous people, men and women, and children as well, that provide the European perspective of how they dressed at various points in time, and some descriptions. These people were, of course, when thinking from the European perspective, curiosities that needed and were desired to be. The desire was there to describe the curiosities that were encountered. Thomas Campanius Holm in 1702 writes that the American Indians are tall, strong, nimble, and their limbs are well proportioned. They have broad faces, small black eyes, flat noses, large lips, and short, broad teeth, but very white. They have no beard. Their hair is black and straight, They cut it short, except a small tuft at the top of the head. Their color is not entirely black, but brown or yellowish. They wear no clothes, but go generally naked. For that reason, they anoint themselves with bear's grease and a kind of black paint, which they find on the shore, that their bodies may endure better the heat of the sun. It should be noted that in the 17th and 18th centuries, to be naked just meant to be in a state of undress. That is, not dressed completely, formally, in a manner that is appropriate for being in public. So anything that is less than that was considered naked. One of the earliest descriptions we have of women comes from Verrazano, who was in Newport Harbor in Rhode Island in 1524. He writes, "Their women are of the same form and beauty, very graceful, of fine countenances, and pleasing appearance in manners and modesty. They wear no clothing except a deerskin, ornamented like those worn by the men. Some wear very rich lynx skins upon their arms, and various ornaments upon their heads, composed of braids of hair, which also hang down upon their breasts on each side." JCB, who traveled throughout New France, describes the women he encountered this way. "The women are unlike the men in being very proud of their hair. They keep it long, full, and shiny, taking care to rub it frequently with bear's grease, which thickens it, and covering it with black powder made of rotten wood. They make it as large as one's fist, and then wrap it in eel or snakeskin. As their hair often grows long, they turn it up halfway down, making the pigtail thicker and as large at the bottom as at the top." And Pierre Pouchot adds, "They wear their hair parted in the middle of the forehead, and so arranged as to cover a part of their ears and fastened behind by a queue which falls down to the waist. This queue, which is shaped like a lobster's tail, is about 4 inches wide above and 3 below, and somewhat flat. It is covered with an eel skin wrapped around it and colored red." And before we move on, I want you to take note of the skirt that the woman is wearing in this image, and we will return to that. Well, we'll discuss that shortly. There was a lot of commentary about decorative items that women and men wore. For women, they as a rule do not make slits in their ears, and I'll add the parentheses, as the men do, but often pierce several holes in them for jewelry. The women also wear bracelets and collars of porcelain beads, by which they mean wampum, around their neck and arms. They wear a skirt of deerskin. This goes around the body and is folded double over a belt or cord around the hips. This skirt, called a matchcoat, reaches only to the knees. And this is one example you see in this illustration of that type of skirt. And 2 slides previous, the woman standing and pounding corn, grinding corn, was wearing she's depicted wearing a much simpler version of that particular style of skirt. Their shoes are slippers made of stag or a kind of deerskin, tanned like goatskin and very soft. On the top of the foot, it is laced and covered with fringe, and at the ankle, it is 2 fingers wide. Again, from Pierre Pouchot. And so these are examples of the moccasins from a drawing in the 18th century. The women of every nation generally place a spot of paint, about the size of a crown piece, against each ear. Some of them put paint on their hair and sometimes a small spot in the middle of the forehead. This is James Carver's observation. And I will add that most Algonquin women and Iroquoian women as well did the red spots just in front of the ears. They could be of varying sizes, some just the dot of the finger of a fingertip, and others quite large. My understanding is that the size sometimes was dictated by the need for the paint. Was it ceremonial or was this everyday? The red through the center part is very common. That serves two functions. It is certainly very decorative, but secondly, it serves as a sunscreen. It protects the part in your hair, that part of your scalp, from being burned, because Indigenous people were still subject to sunburn. Painting was an everyday occurrence for men and women. And the degree of paint and the types of designs of paint that were used depended on the reasons for paint. If you're painting for ceremonies, or if a man is painting to go off into war, it's a much more elaborate design with often more colors than one might find in just the type of body decoration that was an everyday. And the colors on this woman's face are that bright red vermilion color, which we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. During the time before contact, the color was a very earthy, brick-colored red that was produced by grinding red pigmented stones and combining that with bear oil. So it gave that brick red. There are no, to my knowledge, pictures of that type of paint. We'll next examine the items of trade goods that produce the most significant changes in women's lives, because once trade starts in the early 1500s, the flood of available goods comes to this country, then women's lives are significantly changed. One of the first, most simple, of the cooking pots. In 1674, Daniel Gookin writes, "Now they generally get kettles of brass, copper, or iron." And remember, he commented earlier on the clay pots. "These they find more lasting than those made of clay, which were subject to be broken. And the clay or earth they were made of was very scarce and dear." It became harder to find as European settlers took over more and more land, controlled more waterways, diverted streams, and that clay became less accessible. But there were reasons why these clay pots these brass and iron and copper pots were desirable. If you were part of the previous conversation on trade goods, then we kind of enumerated some of the reasons why the metal pot might be more desirable. And I'll give you a chance, if you weren't part of that conversation, to maybe put an observation in the chat about what you think is an advantageous quality of a metal pot versus a brass pot, because they were quickly adopted. And by the later 17th century, the Algonquin clay pot designs deteriorated dramatically with the use of brass kettles. Compared with collared designs of the previous century, pottery made by New England's indigenous people began to be less well-shaped, lost the designs, and lost the elaborate motifs that they had. And in fact, many of them began to be made to resemble more these European cooking pots. It's not dissimilar to what happens today. New technology replaces old technology. We now, for example, spend more time typing than we do writing or printing. And as a result, many of when forced to write by hand, have found that our handwriting has deteriorated. The other thing that happened with the adoption of these metal pots was that the knowledge of how to produce the clay pots disappeared as the older women passed away. When trade stopped, as it did periodically for a variety of reasons, and the metal pots wore out, the women were forced to reacquire this skill, reinvent the art of making the clay pot to be able to have some replacement cooking vessels. I'm going to take a look at the chat and see. Nope, I didn't see anything. So advantages, it has a handle where a clay pot does not. It's more stable. It's lighter weight. It does not break as easily. It will hold a number of different substances easily. It can be used for picking berries, although baskets could as well, but just as well as it could be used for boiling water over a fire. And even dented and damaged, it still works. Metal hoes replaced the clamshell. Metal hoe heads replaced clamshells, easing women's work considerably. The sharpness and weight of the hoe head allowed women to dig deeper into the ground to make to improve their fields, and for a time it increased the amount of land that they could farm. Flint and steel, and these are strikers that are part of that flint and steel combination. Strikers and the flint and steel method of starting fires made a really significant impact on everybody's life. Lighting a fire with the flint and steel is much, much easier. It lights almost no matter the weather, as long as the flint is available. It's a significant technological improvements over the methods that had been used for centuries. And they were common items of trade, so readily available. Needles, thread, thimbles, scissors. These were considered trinkets by the Europeans. They brought thousands of thimbles over, tens of thousands of needles, and for the Europeans had no value. But these simple metal objects were important improvements over the bone and stone tools that women had used for centuries. They no longer had to punch a hole with a bone awl into a deer skin and then lace it using a bone lacing needle and spruce root or sinew. They no longer had to cut with a stone knife. One thimble protects a finger. Many thimbles, alternative use here, can be tied together to make a tinkling bracelet, a necklace, or even an ankle bracelet. So a utilitarian object that then gets used to produce music and bring attention to the wearer. Wool, linen, and cotton fabric replaced animal skins. This eliminated the need to prepare as many hides as were needed for clothing and blankets. Now, indigenous people still wore deerskin moccasins, so hides needed to be prepared for that, and the hides needed to be dressed to be used in trade. But the process to go from the raw hide to the completely brain tan hide is now mostly eliminated. And this also meant that more hides would go to the trade, and that meant that more trade goods and food became available, beginning to create a vicious cycle of dependence here. Now, wool has obvious advantages. It's ready-made, available sometimes in specific sizes, the sizes for a blanket, for example, the right size for a match coat skirt. It was also available in many colors, many weights, many thicknesses. And in fact, the traders often offered to their customers the put specific colors and weights and types of fabric that they liked best. We see that in William Johnson's records, where he makes commentary about what is a preferred type of fabric and preferred colors. Wool keeps you warm even when it's wet. It's easy to cut. And now that women have needles and thread, easy to sew and embellish with traded silk ribbons. Glass and pottery, and we see an example of a glass bottle on the bottom, replace gourds for holding water. Bottles and pottery don't need to be grown, don't need to be made. They're shaped to be stable. And even though they were glass or pottery, they're much sturdier. A mirror, again, something considered an insignificant item by the Europeans, completely changed how a person thought about themselves. It is difficult for us to imagine what it must be like, what it must have been like to see one's reflection really clearly for the first time. Cinnabar, or vermilion, was replaced the ground stone, as the preferred coloring. It just has just such an intense red. Peter Kalm writes, with this, they paint their face, shirt, and several parts of the body. The Europeans brought them vermilion. They thought nothing was comparable to it in color. Glass beads replaced stone, bone, pottery, and wampum as jewelry. The beads were ready-made. They become available in an amazing array of colors, including blue, which was important because it was the color of sky and is not a color that was readily obtained in nature, and red, the color of blood or life. Silver brooches, rings, and ornaments, additional trade items worn to decorate clothing and the body. Richard Smith observes some of the women wear silver brooches, each of which passes for a shilling, and are as current among the Indians as money. Brant's wife had several tier of them in her dress, to the amount perhaps of 10 or 15 pounds. The simple circles with the line through them are just ring brooches. Tens of thousands of ring brooches were brought in to decorate everything from articles of clothing, bags, straps, belts. And the others are a variety of different brooches, and there is a couple of crosses as well. All of these items come in as trade and are worn decoratively. With the introduction of trade goods like shirts and wool, a woman's way of dressing began to change. Trade goods were slowly incorporated into clothing. The basic style of the clothes doesn't change. But what does are the materials. Women, however, were the slower members of the village to incorporate these new options into their clothing. Many continued to dress in the traditional ways. Others added one or two articles of clothing. Some dressed with European clothing when in the company of English or French, and upon their return to the village, changed back into their more traditional garments. As we see Roger Williams, who observed in 1643, while they're amongst the English, they keep on the English apparel, but pull off all as soon as they come again unto their own houses and company. And another observation, the women were not so quick to give up the customs of their forefathers and clothe themselves according to the new styles, but stuck to the old fashions in everything. Well, change, though, does come. And by the time we get to the 18th century, in New England, there is very little wearing of the old style of clothing, except for moccasins. Moccasins remain made of deerskin. That's the one area that for the most part, the indigenous people were not willing to give up their moccasins for English or French shoes. Now we're gonna take a look at 3 different depictions of Native people by Europeans in the 18th century. We'll look at some of the items that they have that are the items of clothing that they're wearing that are now trade goods, and descriptions of these. So this first of an Algonquian man and woman. Pere Pouchot observes both women and men wear a blanket for their shoulders, either of wool, which they buy of Europeans, or of cloth. They ornament the lower part with a dozen strips of yellow, red, or blue ribbon and English edging, leaving the breadth of a ribbon between the rows. At the end of these bands, they leave 5 or 6 fingers' breadth of ribbons hanging free. They are fastened above with round silver buckles, like the ring brooches, 3/4 of an inch across. And so we see then here they are wearing probably white wool blankets. But if you look further, they've both decorated their faces with the vermilion. The woman is wearing a wool match coat that looks like it's got ribbon decorating it. The man's breechcloth is also blue wool, and both of them probably are wearing blue wool leggings, one set red, one set blue. The man's definitely edged with beading. And then you can see, just pick out, well, you can pick out the beads the woman is wearing and the earrings that she's wearing. In this other next drawing of Abenakis, we see different variations in the style of clothing, but still largely clothing made of trade goods. As Peter Collum writes, they were Abenaki Indians. The women who had come hither had their funnel-shaped caps trimmed on the outside with white glass beads. They also had on French women's waists and jackets, which I had never before seen natives wearing. So these are examples of those cone. This is the cone-shaped hat. This is the Northern Abenakis. And then this is a hood, also made of wool and decorated with probably worked ribbons, feathers at the peaks. Both man and woman are wearing jewelry, silver jewelry. They have nose rings and earrings. She's wearing a woman's shift, it looks like. And then both of them with wool blankets. And you see her leggings that are edged, most likely with ribbon. And he also has leggings and garters. The women wear an under petticoat called a match coat made of an L, which is a little over a yard, of blue or red cloth. They ornament the lower part with a dozen strips of yellow, red, or blue ribbon or English edge lace. It is fastened about the waist with a strap. The shirt passes over and covers this. This woman has, has everything going. First of all, the blanket that she has illustrates that decorative use of ribbons. So these, you see the rows of ribbon. And if you look closely, you can even see the extra ribbon the extra 5 to 6 fingers breadth of ribbon that is hanging off, decoratively hanging off the edges. She's probably wearing a white and blue striped linen shirt with ruffled edge. She's added ribbon, red ribbon to it. Her burden strap that supports the cradle board looks to be blue wool that's been embroidered with white beading. Her skirt is decorated with ribbons, and it looks to be she's got the ring brooches all around the perimeter of her skirt. Leggings also of blue wool. So the skirt and the leggings again of blue wool, decorated with green ribbon. and she's wearing garters that have pendants and still retaining the deerskin moccasins. Silver hair plates became a very popular way of dressing women's hair, that moving up a little bit from the eel skin that had been, sorry again, I have a very sensitive mouth, evidently. Most of the females who dwell on the east side of the Mississippi decorate their heads by enclosing their hair either in ribbons or in plates of silver. The silver is formed into thin plates of about 4 inches broad, in several of which they confine their hair. That plate that is nearest the head is of a considerable width, the next narrower, and made so as to pass a little way under the other. And in this manner, they fasten into each other and gradually tapering descend to the waist. It's J. Carver. So you see that descending pattern of the silver hair ornaments, and then the end tied with silk. Note also the exotic dyed feather decorating the hair. This is a modern picture. Some have this ornament above with a silver plate of 2 or 3 fingers breadth wide, and below by little triangles, also of silver or something else. And then Pouchot goes on to add, which does not have a bad effect. Evidently, he liked the use of silver hair plates. Earlier, we saw the comment that women pierce their ears with multiple holes for jewelry. When we get into the 18th century and the availability of silver earrings, especially ball and cone earrings such as these, we see that it is it's very common for women to wear many, many earrings. Now, those moccasins, which remain made of deerskin, change significantly in their appearance with the introduction of a variety with better tools and materials for decoration. As Pierre Pouchot writes, bordered with porcupine quills dyed of different colors and furnished with little pendants of copper, that would be these cones, having tufts of colored hair, right here, and with little bells which tinkle as they walk. And this also has woven porcupine quill that enhance the moccasins. These are not everyday moccasins, most likely. They're ceremonial, with the small white seed beads and then porcupine quill embroidery adding to them. The colors, the bright colors of red, are obtained from red dyes that became available, and from the cinnabar as well, which allowed them to get this. This is dyed deer hair, so dyed red, it gets that intense color. Now, better tools and better materials spurred a creative expansion of many women's traditional decorative work, such as quill work and weaving. We'll examine this in much greater detail in our next conversation. In addition to the moccasins we just saw in the previous slide, this slide shows 4 beautiful examples of this new creative work. So we have a bag with porcupine quill embroidery and cones and deer hide and deer hair, dyed deer hair, and very elaborately designed woven bag. Pipe bag, this is made of otter skin that is embroidered with porcupine quills and has cones and deer hair. And then another example of a beautifully designed woven bag. Now we've covered, we've really focused on the domestic life of Indigenous women, but women were also leaders of their people. 2 examples are Weetamoo, who lived from 1635 to 1676. She was a Wampanoag Sunksqua, a female sachem, and she led her people during King Philip's War. And then there is Kanwatsit Tsiatsiani, otherwise known as Daganwadanti, or Mary Molly Brandt. She lived a century later, from 1736 until 1796. She married Sir William Johnson, who was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British. It was Kanwatsit who urged the Haudenosaunee, and especially her Mohawk families, to ally with the British during the Revolutionary War. And as a result of her urgings, all but the Tuscarora and the Oneida did join and ally with the British during the war. William Johnson died in 1774, leaving her a widow with children. But she was focused both during and after the war, desperately trying to preserve her people's land and heritage. During the war, she supplied guns and ammunition. She sheltered and fed loyalists, and she passed military information and served as an intermediary between the Haudenosaunee and the British. When, after the 1779 massacre by General John Sullivan and American troops of several Mohawk villages, she petitioned repeatedly and eventually was compensated for the massacre and received land in Canada for the Haudenosaunee people, and continued as an advocate throughout her lifetime. Now, Algonquin society is matriarchal. Familial bonds of kinship and clanship pass through the maternal line. Women participated equally in the governance of their communities. Now, men typically occupied the role and positions of sachems, making decisions about day-to-day activities of the community. Women, especially older women, made up a council of elders that had equal authority. While sachems could make a plan for war or to relocate a village or engage in trade, that plan must be approved by the Council of Women Elders before it could be set into motion. And it was that same Council of Women Elders who also approved all important and large trades. In the communities, women had control over most of the possessions of their households. A man's possessions were only his tools and equipment and the clothes he wore. Should a man not fulfill his responsibilities to his wife and family, she had the right to put his few belongings outside the wigwam, signifying both to him and to the entire community that their relationship was ended. In 1784, Benjamin Franklin provides us with a summary of Indigenous women of the Northeast. The Indian women tilled the ground, dress food, nurse and bring up children, and preserve and hand down to posterity the memory of public transactions. The business of the women is to take exact notice of what passes, imprint it in their memories, for they have no writings, and communicate it to their children. They are the records of the council, and they preserve traditions of the stipulations in treaties 100 years back. Women were the keepers of community history, language, and culture. During this period of extraordinary change, women passed essential tribal knowledge from generation to generation, ensuring by their actions the continuity and survival of their culture. And I thank you very much for your attention and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
There will be a recording available after the presentation.
I will comment and say that this was I won't say brief because it did last about 50 minutes, but an overview of 250 years of change, and that there is increasing body of work out there that can help you delve a little deeper into how trade and European colonialism affected and impacted Native American women.
Gail, we have a question if you'd be prepared to speak in Canada. And what I'll do is I'll ask Frank Nicholson to text me and I'll share your information with him.
Okay.
We have a question. Did the Indians get skin infections from the paint on their skin? And that's a question from Kathy Machancic.
I haven't seen much written about it, much of anything written about it. I would say that probably did not get infections from the simple stone and bear oil powders that they initially used. However, vermilion, cinnabar, is sulfonated mercury. There is nothing good about it. And in the same way that it caused lesions on European women's lips and cheeks when they used it, it no doubt caused problems on Indigenous people's skin. Absolutely.
We have another question from Jean Johnson. The question is, did military losses, for example, the Mohawk in the American Revolution, negatively impact matriarchal roles of women?
That's an interesting question. I don't, well, military losses would have significantly impacted the hunting that was the man's main occupation as hunters, as fishermen. So it would have removed from the populations this whole cohort of who could accomplish this work. It would put an incredible stress on any village, any community. I believe that it did not negatively impact matriarchal society. And in fact, it probably did the opposite and enhanced and supported and expanded women's roles as they had to pick up the pieces and maintain their society.
We have another question here. Does bear's grease go rancid?
Yes, it does. And that's an advantage that wasn't used as an advantage. In the summertime, they coated their bodies with bear's grease, which went rancid and kept away gnats and mosquitoes. In the wintertime, they didn't have to worry about that, coat their bodies with it, and it provided a layer of insulation. And I think I'd mentioned before, but may not have. We'll talk about another use of bear grease in our last segment on food.
Now, Judy Jaguar has a comment. Women were also the healers as well. I don't know if you want to respond to that comment.
They were. And I think I mentioned it briefly when I said that they were responsible for the health of the family in much the same way that men and women now, the moms and dads out there, you are your children's the first go-to when they've got the stomach ache or the sniffles. And women, part of what they gathered, what they foraged for, were the medicinal plants that they used to treat the illnesses of their families. And the many, many plants in the Northeast are very effective herbal medicines. In fact, the colonists coming over brought their own medicines, their own herbs, their own plants with them, but they came to rely on the knowledge of the Indigenous women in terms of what plants grew naturally in the Northeast that were medicinal. By the time you get into the early 19th century, that role of itinerant healer is one that is taken up by some of the few women who remained at this time living around New England villages, and they would often come into a village with a selection of herbal medicines and barter and trade with people for food and for other goods in exchange for the indigenous herbal medicines. It's a wonderful intriguing, interesting, eye-opening topic that it's one I've talked about and demonstrated in the past, and it's well worth investigating. There's some really good books written about indigenous herbal medicines.
Well, I was going to just encourage everyone to register for our February 15th program, which is Art and Everyday Items. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, Gail?
We are going to take a look at the really over 200-year period that has been the focus of our conversations, at the magnificent and wide-ranging art and artistry and artisanship of Northeast America's indigenous people.
Thank you, Gail. We have a comment here, and I wish that Lee, if I were to ask you to allow you to speak, if you could just give us your greeting on your way out. Would you mind if we do that? I'll allow you to speak, and you can. Looks like she signed out already, but I think Jan says it nicely for all of us. Thank you very much, Gail. Your lectures are very informative and interesting.
I appreciate that very much. I appreciate the audience. I appreciate all of you and your interest in these topics. And it is a pleasure to share this fascinating and very large topic with you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our conversation club, When Two Worlds Met, with Gail Whiteusher. Have a good evening.
Labish Kanawith.